What if your greatest creation became your greatest frustration? This was the curious case of Arthur Conan Doyle and his iconic character, Sherlock Holmes. In the late 19th century, a young Scottish physician, Arthur Conan Doyle, took the world by storm with his creation of a singularly unique character, the brilliant and enigmatic detective Sherlock Holmes. With his razor-sharp intellect and his uncanny ability to deduce the most intricate details from the seemingly mundane, Holmes quickly became a beloved figure in the literary world. Doyle's stories were a breath of fresh air in an era of formulaic detective fiction. They were filled with suspense, intrigue, and a level of intellectual stimulation that was unprecedented. The public was utterly captivated by Sherlock Holmes, and they couldn't get enough. Suddenly, Arthur Conan Doyle found himself in the limelight, his name synonymous with the world's greatest detective. He was hailed as a literary genius, and his stories flew off the shelves. But while the world was enamored with Sherlock Holmes, a storm was brewing within Arthur Conan Doyle. For Doyle, Holmes was a mere character, a product of his imagination. But the public's fascination with Holmes was so intense, it began to eclipse Doyle himself. The more the world fell in love with Holmes, the more Doyle felt overshadowed by his own creation. Doyle was not just the author of the Sherlock Holmes stories, he was a prolific writer, a man of many talents who had penned numerous other works of literature. Yet he found that his other works, which he considered more important than the adventures of Sherlock Holmes, were being overlooked. The public's obsession with Holmes was so overwhelming that it was all they wanted to read. This began to breed a deep-seated resentment within Doyle. His greatest creation, the character that had brought him fame and success, was also his greatest source of frustration. As the world continued to clamor for more Sherlock Holmes, Doyle found himself trapped in the shadow of his own creation. But as Holmes's popularity grew, Doyle's resentment towards his creation began to simmer. Sherlock Holmes was no ordinary character. He was a sensation, a phenomenon that took the world by storm. This detective, with his deerstalker hat and magnifying glass, quickly became a global icon. But what was it about Holmes that captured and held the attention of readers across the globe? Holmes, as created by Doyle, was a character of exceptional intellect and uncanny deductive skills. He had an insatiable curiosity and a keen eye for detail, traits that made him a formidable detective. His ability to make sense of the most intricate and obscure clues was nothing short of extraordinary. And it wasn't just his intelligence that made him appealing, it was also his eccentricities, his unconventional methods, and his distinct personality that set him apart from other fictional detectives of the time. But Sherlock Holmes wasn't just about solving mysteries. He was a character with depth, with his own set of strengths and weaknesses, his own quirks and idiosyncrasies. He was a genius but also a recluse, a man of science but also an artist, a master of disguise but also a violinist. This complexity made him relatable, human, and incredibly fascinating. The stories themselves were equally compelling. Each tale was a finely crafted puzzle, a web of intrigue and suspense that kept readers on the edge of their seats. The world of Sherlock Holmes was one of foggy London streets, shadowy figures, and thrilling adventures. Each story was a journey into the mind of this remarkable detective, a chance to see the world through his eyes. And then there was the relationship between Holmes and his loyal friend, Dr. Watson. This bond added a layer of emotional depth to the stories and provided a counterbalance to Holmes's intense focus on logic and reason. It was a friendship that resonated with readers, adding yet another dimension to these already rich and engaging tales. But for Doyle, Holmes's success was a double-edged sword. The character he had created had become larger than life, a phenomenon that was both a testament to his talent as a writer and a source of deep personal conflict. But that's a story for another time. As Sherlock Holmes rose to fame, Arthur Conan Doyle began to feel overshadowed by his own creation. A curious predicament, isn't it? Imagine an artist feeling threatened by the very masterpiece he himself had crafted. It's like a painter feeling outshone by his painting, a sculptor dwarfed by his statue. Doyle was no ordinary author. He had penned numerous works of historical novels, plays, romances, poetry, and non-fiction. Yet it was his work of fiction, the detective stories featuring Sherlock Holmes, that garnered overwhelming attention. It was as if his other literary endeavors were consigned to oblivion, obscured by the towering figure of Holmes. Holmes, with his deerstalker hat, pipe, and magnifying glass, had become a cultural icon. He was the embodiment of logic and reason, the master of deduction, and people couldn't get enough of him. But while the world was engrossed in the adventures of the detective, Doyle felt his own identity was being eclipsed. Doyle was more than the creator of Sherlock Holmes. He was a writer with a diverse portfolio, a man of many talents, yet the world seemed to only see him through the lens of Holmes. His other works, which he held in high regard, were overlooked, overshadowed by the detective's popularity. The irony was not lost on Doyle. His own creation was becoming more recognized than he was. This situation led to an internal conflict within Doyle. He began to resent Holmes, the character that had brought him fame, yet was stifling his creative identity. It was a struggle, a battle between the author and his creation. And this conflict was not without consequences. This internal turmoil, this growing resentment, led Doyle to contemplate a drastic move. He began to toy with the idea of getting rid of Holmes, the very character that had brought him so much acclaim. He felt that only by doing so could he regain his identity, could he emerge from the shadow of Sherlock Holmes. This conflict led Doyle to make a drastic decision. A decision that would shock the world and forever change the destiny of Sherlock Holmes. In an attempt to break free from the shadow of Sherlock Holmes, Arthur Conan Doyle decided to kill off his character. It was a decision that shook the literary world, a decision that would immortalize the character of Sherlock Holmes in a way Doyle could not have anticipated. The year was 1893 and Doyle penned the story, The Final Problem. This short tale was meant to be the end of Holmes, the capstone to his adventures. In it, Holmes faces off against his greatest adversary, Professor Moriarty, in a fatal confrontation at the Reichenbach Falls. In the end, both Holmes and Moriarty disappear, presumed dead in the swirling waters below. Doyle had finally freed himself from the detective that had so consumed his life and career. But the public's reaction was nothing short of an uproar. Readers were outraged, devastated, and inconsolable. They mourned the fictional detective as though he were a real person. Letters poured into the offices of the Strand magazine, the publication where Holmes's adventures were serialized. Readers pleaded, begged, and demanded that Doyle bring Holmes back from the dead. Some even wore black armbands in public, a symbol of their grief over the loss of the beloved character. Caught off guard by the intensity of the public's reaction, Doyle found himself in a difficult position. He had wanted to be free of Holmes, to focus on other literary pursuits he considered more significant. But the public's demand for more Sherlock Holmes was overwhelming. Despite Doyle's intentions, the death of Sherlock Holmes only served to increase the character's popularity. Holmes had transcended the page to become a cultural icon, a symbol of deductive reasoning and intellectual prowess. But even in death, Sherlock Holmes continued to overshadow his creator. Arthur Conan Doyle's relationship with Sherlock Holmes was one of love, resentment, and ultimately, acceptance. While Doyle may have initially resented the attention that Sherlock Holmes garnered, a part of him couldn't ignore the fact that his creation had taken on a life of its own. As much as he tried to escape the shadow of his detective, Doyle was inevitably pulled back into the world of Holmes and Watson by the sheer force of public demand. Following the supposed death of Sherlock Holmes at the Reichenbach Falls, the outcry was immense. Public grief was palpable, and the pressure for Holmes's resurrection was insurmountable. So, despite his earlier desire to be rid of the detective, Doyle found himself bringing Holmes back to life in The Adventure of the Empty House, published in 1903, 8 years after Holmes's supposed demise. But something had changed. Doyle's return to Holmes was not begrudging, but rather it was marked by a newfound acceptance. He no longer resented the detective's popularity, but embraced it. He channeled this acceptance into his writing, creating some of the most memorable and beloved stories in the Holmes canon during this period. Perhaps Doyle saw a reflection of his own struggles in Holmes, the constant pursuit of truth, the battle against societal expectations, and the paradox of being known yet misunderstood. It was a relationship that evolved from resentment to acceptance, from creator creation to almost equals. Doyle's acceptance of Holmes's popularity was not a surrender, but a reconciliation. He realized that Holmes had become an entity larger than himself, a symbol of deductive reasoning, and a beacon of truth in an increasingly complex world. In the end, Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes shared a complex bond, a testament to the power of literature and the impact of a truly unforgettable character. Indeed, their relationship was a dance of love, resentment, and acceptance, a dance that continues to captivate readers to this day.